Hi everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Anne and I am the consultant at the Digital Transformation Hub, a part of the Info Exchange group with Connecting Up. What the Hub focuses on digital technology as an enabler to support service transformation and new ways of working, assisting nonprofits on a broader digital transformation journey. We facilitate an annual training calendar to help the social sector upskill in all things digital. Before we begin, we'll start with a bit of housekeeping. All lines are muted, so if you have any technical issue, please type it into the chat box on your webinar panel and I can assist you. If you have any questions during the session, please also type in the chat box and Maurice will answer them by the end of the webinar. We really encourage you to ask as many questions as you think throughout the session to make this as interactive a session as possible. No question is too silly. If you're on a Wi-Fi connection and have multiple programs open, this can sometimes affect the quality of the audio and the video of the webinar. If possible, please close all other programs to help you have the best experience. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and a link to the recording and the slides will be sent to you as soon as we can after the webinar ends. Before we start, I would also to remind you that there will be a short survey at the end of the webinar. Today, I'm excited to welcome you to Cybersecurity 101. Do you know how to keep your organization secure with Maurice? Hi, Maurice.
Hi, Anne. Thank you for the introduction and welcome everyone to this webinar on Cybersecurity 101 with essentials to keep your organization secure. So we're running this as a 30-minute session with approximately 20 minutes of content and time for questions and answers at the end. Feel free to put your questions in the chat as we go and we'll get to them at the end of the content. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today's webinar will cover a view of cybersecurity threats facing organizations, the top 5 things all not-for-profit staff must know to keep their organization's data safe, a high-level overview of imperative measures every organization needs to have in place, some resources for you, and then some questions and answers. So cybersecurity practices or information security practices are no longer a nice to have. Given the increasing nature of our digital footprint and increasing threats, we must build resilience into our organizations as far as security goes. Security has been in the headlines every month with a number of organizations across all sectors of the economy being affected. A view of some of the headlines within the community services sector as well as government from the past year are on this slide. So on the top left, Oxfam had donor information of over 1 million Australians disclosed via a data breach when a database was accessed via a security incident. The incident in March on the right involved a caseworker who worked at a community services organization and had access to an IT system provided by the Department of Health and Human Services. After leaving the position, his access to the system was not revoked, and he accessed confidential information related to children and committed sex offenses. On the bottom left, Uniting Care had an attack on some of its IT systems and had to resort to manual workarounds due to IT systems being inaccessible. And the last one on the right there, an incident experienced by Uniting Communities where staff were unable to access certain systems due to a cyber incident. This would again have required manual workarounds and change in business process. A few more on these slides. On the top there, linked to the MySA government IT system where individuals' accounts were accessed by stolen password credentials. This was possible because people had used the same passwords across online IT systems, and when one of these systems is compromised and passwords obtained, the same passwords give access to their MySA Gov accounts, and hence details such as driver's license numbers, which are a key piece of identity information. And the last one there is fairly recent. The Australian Red Cross indicated clients are potentially caught up in a cyber attack where a database of the parent organization, the International Committee of the Red Cross, was compromised with personal information of people who had sought services for loved ones being compromised. So as you can see, the impacts of these incidents from cyber attacks, they vary. With some cases, data is locked up and inaccessible due to what is known as ransomware. In other cases, personal information is disclosed via a data breach, leading to a privacy breach. And here are some statistics on scams and cybercrime in Australia. The data points are important to review because they highlight what's going on in the landscape. The Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, the ACCC, points out that it's very common for scammers to utilize current events and crises to make their scams appear more legitimate. We saw this in 2020, where scammers first used the bushfire emergency and then the COVID-19 pandemic as a basis for new scams. Some statistics there with a loss of over $850 million in 2020 to scams. On the right, a statistic from the Australian Cybersecurity Centre from the recent cyber threat report notes that over the 2020-2021 financial year, there have been over 67,500 cybercrime reports, and this equates to one report every 8 minutes. So these increasing events in our headlines and statistics on cybercrime are indeed a call to action for organizations to review their cybersecurity practices. A key message is that the human element is significant in the delivery of security in today's organizations. The human element is that people component. For example, for staff to be aware of certain processes and how to securely share information, or how to use technology securely by creating a strong password. Security behaviors and the culture and sentiment and security within an organization are greatly influenced by you and your perception of risk. And most importantly, these perceptions can be changed. Security is everyone's responsibility in an organization. So before we get into the content on the top 5 things to keep your organization's data safe, I wanted to mention that it was recently Safer Internet Day last Tuesday. Safe Internet Day is a global initiative, and in Australia, the eSafety Commissioner provides a range of resources to raise awareness about online safety within families, organizations, and schools. I encourage you to visit the eSafety website for more information. The link is on this slide, and it's also in the resource section at the end of this pack. It's important to remember that while security is important in an organizational context, it's also important for us in our personal environments, within our families, for those of us who have children who do more work online as well. It's an important consideration. So let's get into the top 5 things you must know to keep your organization's data safe. The first one is know how to spot a phishing email. Phishing emails are sent with the aim of tricking the recipient into clicking on links, opening attachments, or giving up their personal information. So on this slide here, a staff member received this email about messages that could not be delivered. If you look at the time, it was 6:26 on a Tuesday morning, would have probably been one of the first emails they saw when they opened their mailbox that morning. So this particular staff member clicked on the review button, which is that big red button at the bottom, and was presented with what looked like a standard SharePoint page. The organization uses Office 365. And the SharePoint login page had their username already filled in. So they entered in their password and clicked login. Now at that point, they've given up their password and obviously their username, and their account could have been compromised. However, fortunately in this case, multi-factor authentication was employed, which is that additional factor that you can have in addition to password, and account access was blocked. Now the staff member was still asked to change their password. So the telltale signs on this email, you can see the from address. It's a .de extension, wouldn't probably typically be coming from your organization and your Office 365 and have anything to do with quarantine email messages, for example. And also looking at the link there, it's got a number of strange characters and does look odd. So that's some of the telltale signs of a phishing email. Here's another example of a real life phishing email, and this is an example of what is called business email compromise. So this email request was received by payroll department, appearing to be from a staff member requesting a change of bank details. So saying, I've changed my bank details, please make the change within the system so that my pay will be directed into my new bank account. The payroll department initially responded requesting the new bank details and not noticing the from address. The second email was received by payroll, at which point, due to the grammar in the email, they realized that this was not a legitimate request. So again, if you look at the from email, it was directoronly.com. It had nothing to do with the email address of the staff member or the organization, even though the footer of the email, which is blanked out here, had the staff members' names. This is an example of business email compromise, which is seen in cases such as this, with funds being directed to via payroll, or even through supply invoices where supply emails are compromised, or what is called spoofing as well. And this one is a fairly recent, from December. It was an email received again by a staff member. Note the from address. You can see again a .de extension, and it requests payments of a large amount and has an attachment, which what looks like it's an invoice for USD 107,000. And it would be tempting to click on the attachment to see what it's about, but this is another example of a sort of phishing email where there's an attachment provided. So again, looking at the from address and paying careful attention to what the email is asking you to do is important. This is a useful poster which highlights the general attributes of a phishing email. Note that not all these may apply because phishing emails can have different intents. With phishing, the attacker uses social engineering principles to trick the person into performing an action. These principles may be a sense of urgency or scarcity, for example. And if we look at the example here on the screen, the message is that you are eligible for a tax refund. I mean, who wouldn't like that? So it would be enticing to click on that link. However, it's really important to note the signs within the email to determine whether it is legitimate or not. So if you look at, for example, the address it's come from, it's atogov.com. All government addresses in Australia would typically end in .gov.au. Looking at the generic dear taxpayer is another one where there's a generic greeting, attachments like we saw in the previous example that you didn't ask for and would be tempting to want to know what they are, but if it's an attachment you're not expecting, it's best not to open it. The other one is urgent calls for action, the deadline, you've got to do it. They really play on people's emotions. And while this poster references what to watch out for in emails, the same technique is also used to get people into clicking on things and giving up information via phone calls, text messages, and other messaging apps as well. So these are just prevalent means as well, not just emails. So to be aware of what you're asked to open and click on, regardless of the technology that is in use. All right, now we have a poll with 2 questions along the topic of can you spot a phish? And these are taken from the ACCC Scam Watch quiz. This is the first question. You received this email from MyGov asking you to verify your identity. What would you do? So we'll give everybody a couple of seconds to review this. Think about which of the 2 responses on the bottom you'd select, and then we'll have the poll up, which has the same 2 options for you to click on. Okay, and could we have the poll up, please? So you should be able to see the poll on your screen. If you select one of the 2 options, that would be great.
A few more people are voting. So 93% voted.
Okay.
A bit more for everyone to vote.
Are we done, Anne?
96%. Should I close?
Okay. A couple more seconds, just if anybody else is still wanting to participate in the poll, and then we can close it off.
Yeah, oh good.
I can't see the results as yet, Anne.
Still 96%, so I'll close the poll now.
Yes. Okay, sure. Okay, I've seen majority have selected delete the email, it's a scam. That's correct. The Australian government will never ask you to follow a link in an email or SMS to verify your identity. Another sign is that the sender's address is no reply at aussie.com. All government addresses would typically end in .gov.au, as I mentioned previously. Another way to check would be to hover over the link that you see here and just check carefully what the address looks like if it's a gov, for example. We've got another question. Your boss sends you this email. What should you do? Again, we'll give everybody some time to review this, and in a similar fashion, we'll have the poll up with the 2 options that you see below. If you could select one of the options, that would be great. Okay, and if we have the poll up, please. Everybody could just select one of the options.
Um, 93% voted, so we'll wait a bit more. 96% voted.
Okay, a couple more seconds.
Okay, I'll close the vote now.
Okay. Okay, great. Ignore the email and contact IT is the majority. That's correct. This is not your boss. If you look carefully, the sender's address, is different if your manager is John Doe. If you look at the I carefully in the word services, it's a different font that's used, and that's a typical strategy that's used as well to, in a sense, to spoof addresses. And in this case, yes, you would let your manager or your IT team know that you've had a scam attempt. And good practice is to always check, even though you can see the urgency in the email with the word ACE, with the the ASAP there. Always check with your manager that this is something that they've requested. It's better in this case to do that than to lose funds to such a scam. All right, the second point of the top 5 is on protecting information. A number of data breaches happen due to human error and people not storing or sharing information securely. Information is a key asset of an organization and it has value, so it must be protected. And this is particularly true for sensitive information such as health data or client records. So if within your organization you collect information considered confidential or sensitive by certain industry standards or laws, you must take reasonable measures to protect it. So these measures for personal information may be collecting only the information you need for a particular purpose, ensuring that sensitive data such as health records or client records for not-for-profits who may deal with this type of information is stored only in certain locations such as a client and case management system, and access to the system is protected with strong passwords or multi-factor authentication. Another measure may be ensuring there is awareness among volunteers and staff on how certain types of information must be handled and communicated. And also, it's very important to ensure that your data is backed up in the event your machine fails and all your data is on it. You need to be able to recover it. So if your organization's not made it clear as to where you should store certain types of data, then you should ask, because data backups are very important. The third point is on using good password practice. So a good password may be based on a phrase that you know. You could compose the password by picking out the first letters of each word, capitalize some, add in some digits. And you may also hear the term passphrase, which is typically 4 or more random words strung together to make a password. It's important to keep your personal details out of it. It's also really important not to reuse passwords, because if a password is compromised from one system and has been reused on another, it's easy for an attacker to get into the system. And we saw this with some of the headlines with the MySA Gov IT system. And if you need to write passwords down, store them securely, not on a post-it note, for example, on your screen. And if you have too many passwords to remember, consider a good password manager. Another point on this slide is the use of multi-factor authentication, or MFA. It's the practice of using a password and another factor to log into a user's account. And some of the examples of MFA applications are on this slide. So it's a screenshot there of Microsoft Authenticator. There's also Google Authenticator. There's a few around that you could use. And it's best not to share IT system accounts as well and passwords, but understandably, this is not always possible, particularly if you have volunteers within your organizations or groups. So in this case, if you do share accounts, be cautious of how you share the password with others who need to know the password. It's also best to change it if somebody who is using the shared account leaves your organization and they know the password, it's best to change it. The fourth point is on keeping your device or devices secure. This is both in a physical sense as well as securing the software on your device. So, physically protect it when you're traveling, for example. It's also good practice to lock your screen when you step away from your device, because in this way, any information such as, case notes that you might have open is protected, and access to the device as well is also protected. It's very important to keep devices up to date. And this is, operating systems such as your Windows operating system and applications such as web browsers. At this time, when many people may be working remotely, if your PC is used at home sometimes by your children, for example, be aware of what they do on the PC. If they install software such as games, sometimes these can have malicious software components installed as well. If they're accessing games online, again, here there's the risk of visiting websites or clicking on web links that could have malware that could be downloaded onto your machine. There are a number of organizations who report security breaches because they're using an infected home PC without appropriate protections. And the last point there, if you're using your own device, BYOD, bring your own device scenario, such as a mobile phone or other device, make sure that you only store information on there that your organization is comfortable for you to store, and ensure the device has appropriate protection, such as a PIN if it's a mobile phone, and that you have security updates installed. And there's also the option of possibly a remote wipe if you lose the device. If it's a smartphone, having that feature there is also could be useful. Lastly, the last of the top 5, report anything that you're not sure about or seems suspect. Security incidents are adverse events which pose a threat to an organization's information systems and services. They can stem from a variety of sources. So some examples are on this slide. Something that's unfamiliar or strange activity on your device. It's popping up screens or it's extra slow, might be an indication. Disclosure of information to an unauthorized person. So this is, in the case of personal information, sharing information just with those people who need to know it or need to have it for work purposes. Lost devices or lost removable media, such as USB sticks with the organization's information on it. And unescorted people on your office premises may not be so relevant now if many people are still working remotely, but that's still another one that's important, because if you have paper-based documents with confidential or sensitive information on them, an unescorted person is one to be aware of. And the second point there, ensure you know who to report security incidents to within your organization. It could be an internal point, it could be somebody who is an IT contact person who you deal with. Ensure that there's an understanding of who that person is. And the Australian Cybersecurity Centre expanded its 24-hour call centre capabilities to benefit small and medium-sized organisations. That's a useful resource as well. If you're not sure about something from a security perspective, they've got a 1300 number there, and there's also some information on their website. So some of the key takeaways, the first 3 are important for you to know, and the last 4 in grey font are what your organisation should have in place. So always using strong, unique passwords and multi-factor authentication where possible. Being aware of phishing emails. Email addresses can be spoofed, so they appear to come from people you know. So it's important to validate requests if they appear suspicious, as we saw in that second poll question. Remembering that websites can be created to mimic a real supplier or bank to capture your information. So good practice is not to log into a web page that you've reached through a link in an email, particularly if it's for finance related matters. Go into your web browser and go to the website directly. And the last 4, as I said, being aware of where you should be storing sensitive information. If you're not sure in your organization, please ask. Using MFA on accounts, and MFA should be configured on key IT systems by your organization. knowing your IT and security policies, again, made available by your organization, and who to report something to. Have your organization made it clear who the contact point is if you want to report something, that you're not sure about some activity on your device, for example. So this is a listing of some useful resources, some references from the Digital Transformation Hub, as well as a link to the Safer Internet Day resources and the Australian Cybersecurity Centre website, reporting of cybercrime via the Report Cyber link is on the slide as well. That link, Have I Been Pawned, is a useful one. It's a service run by a security researcher, an Australian security researcher, Troy Hunt. You could enter in your email address in there, for example, and check if it's been compromised in a data breach, and maybe then take steps to change your passwords. And a couple of other links on the slide there. The last one is related to Microsoft Office, if there's interest in that as well. All right, I think that wraps up the content, and happy for any questions and discussion now. Over to you, Anne.
Thank you, Marius. First question. If I'm using my own device for work, are there any specific risks associated with that, and how I can manage those?
If you're using your own device for work, yeah, like I said, being clear on what type of information you should be storing on your device, making sure that your organization has made it clear. For example, sensitive information shouldn't be stored on your device. It should be in a particular system. Also, the other thing is making sure you've got an antivirus product and keeping your software and your device, your operating system, web browsers up to date is really important. Some of these systems have an auto update feature, so it's not too time intensive or administrative in that sense. It's a matter of configuring them to auto update, and when there's a new update that's pushed through, you'll get it. When you restart your device, the applications are updated. And also, as I mentioned previously, depending on your own device and who else may use it in your home, being careful as to what is installed on it. If it's children who are installing certain things or using the same device that you use for work purposes, make sure that there's confidentiality of information that is also maintained as well.
Yeah, next, not exactly a question, but Pam sent a thank you, very helpful information. Janet got a question. What happens if we open an attachment or click a link?
If you open an attachment or click a link, yes, in the case of a phishing email. So phishing emails, as I mentioned, can have different intents. If you click a link and you've entered in your password, it's really important to change that password immediately. If you've opened an attachment, it could be that malware might be installed on your device, or a vulnerability in software is compromised, and you have malicious software installed. So in this case, making sure you've got a good antivirus is really important, and keeping your systems up to date. In this case, you should let your IT team know that this has happened. They would typically check access logs. They'd run an antivirus scan on your machine. If you've given up your password, depending on the scenario, they may ask you to change your password. I hope that helps.
Yes. Next question from Christy. Can you recommend any password manager?
Yes, there's a few good ones out there. We've got, through Connecting Up, we've got one called Dashlane. And there's a couple of other ones as well. LastPass and 1Password are also good. The key thing, I think, would be to make sure you've got, in a sense, multi-factor authentication you can use with the password manager. And depending on how you're using it, if it's an organizational context, make sure that you can have separate password vaults within the password manager. It's not just one big vault for everybody in the organization to use. You've got that opportunity to create separate vaults for different teams, for example, in an organization. There's a few other good ones out there, but those are the ones that I'm aware of.
Last question today from Max. Any tips for ensuring SharePoint is as secure as possible?
Sorry, that's for SharePoint?
Yes. Any tips for making SharePoint secure?
Yeah, so SharePoint is typically, it's behind your Office 365 login. So again, I would say, a strong password, the use of multi-factor authentication, because that will protect access to your SharePoint and 365 environment. Another important point, I think, is to look at permissions within SharePoint. in terms of your groups and who's got access to what, depending on how you've set up SharePoint and how SharePoint is used. Make sure that certain people who need access to certain SharePoint sites have it, and those who don't need access to particular sites, for those people it's not provided. I think that's also really important. And also the sharing of links, depending on your organization settings. As you may know, you can share out information from SharePoint via a link, and this could be internal to your organization with specific people who are external to your organization. So making sure there's an understanding of what settings you have configured on SharePoint and how you expect to share information from the portal, from SharePoint, is also key.
There's a final question, which is from Miri. Would you recommend saving your password on your computer?
Saving your password on your computer, is that in a file? I know some people do that. They'd have, for example, a document like a spreadsheet that's got a list of their passwords. And I would say that is not a bad practice, as long as, for example, you have a password applied on the spreadsheet or on the document that only you know. So that could be considered, the primary password. So it's not a bad idea if you have a lot of passwords. It's better than writing them down and making them available on your desk, for example. So that could be an option, but I would say the key would be to ensure that that file itself, or depending on where you're saving it, the file itself is password protected, and not leaving it just on a file that anybody can get into on your machine. Any other questions, Anne?
I think a person just typed in, I think the question is about saving your password in a web browser when you are prompted to save them.
Right. Yeah. I would typically say that that is not, a good practice. I do know that some web browsers have a password management feature. There's pros and cons to that. I would say, web browsers are exactly that. They're a web browser. Password managers have, they're constantly updating their features and, and have different options. For example, the ability to share a password out with somebody else. Also, having your password in your web browser, it means that you would have to keep using the same web browser. And if you go to a different machine, you may not have access to the password. Another point to note is that if anybody has access to your machine and the password of your machine, they can open up your web browser and have a look at your passwords as well. So I would say good practice is to typically use a password manager and not only rely on the likes of password storage within web browsers.
I think, yeah, this is probably the final question because we're running out of time. But
sure.
Max asked, it appears that Microsoft Edge has an inbuilt password manager, and on a Mac it has Keychain. Are they any good as password managers?
Are they as good as password managers? Keychain?
Keychain on Mac and
on a Mac.
Microsoft Edge inbuilt password manager.
Yeah, I suppose the same point about web browsers that I just mentioned would go for Edge. With Keychain, and it's an application on the device. I'm not too familiar with it in the Mac environment, but I would say it's better than leaving your passwords around on your desk. I imagine it has what's called a primary password that you would have to enter to unlock it. And in that case, if that's the option you have, then I would say use that, keep your device up to date, make sure you've got a strong password which is used to enter Keychain. That's the suggestions I would give there.
Yeah, thank you, Maurice. If you have any other question, please feel free to send it through the survey form or reply to our follow-up email after this webinar. Thank you, Maurice, and thank you all for joining us today. Have a nice day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.